wanted to share with you something I saw today. It's about 9 minutes long, and it's by It's Me Subhi, S-U-B-H-I, on Instagram, and he explains the map of Palestine, and it's really well done. Of course, you can find explanations of this on the Empire Files with Abby Martin, where it's how Palestine became colonized, I think is the name of that particular video on Empire Files. You can find that on YouTube. And also, of course, Gaza Fights for Freedom. Which is a wonderful documentary about the plight of Gazans under Israeli occupation. And that's the short of it. And so check that out. Check out Gaza Fights for Freedom. It's, because it's been made available free. It wasn't very much to start with, but to pay for that particular, to watch it, but now it's free. A lot of good discussion about that particular documentary, so please check that out. But anyway, this particular thing by It's Me Subhi, I don't know his whole name really, but I'll put a link to his Instagram. It's actually, he's done a few videos now. I haven't watched them, but I imagine they're probably fairly good. And I think this one is pretty good, and it explains how Palestine became colonized. So thanks for watching, and please let's keep up the spread of information, real information, not corporate media propaganda, but real information about Palestine, about Palestinians, because there's so much corporate media propaganda out there, as well as, you know, what politicians are putting out there. And by the way, speaking of politicians, Ro Khanna is just proving once more what a not progressive he is. With not only did he recently sign a letter with 120 Democrats that was basically defending the US giving Israel $10 million every day of military aid, and basically saying that Israel should not be penalized because of its human rights crimes, basically. So that's the so-called progressive for you. Somebody who is basically defending the giving of $10 million of military aid every day to an apartheid state, which is brutalizing the indigenous population. And he's basically wants no consequences, no ending of that aid, which should basically be just a no-brainer. He's basically defending that aid, even though the Israeli government is brutalizing the indigenous and killing the indigenous population and causing and doing a genocide of that indigenous population. These are the kinds of so-called progressives that are in the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party is a party where social movements go to die. And the sooner people wake up to that, the better. You cannot trust these people. Maybe Rashida Tlaib, because she is Palestinian, on this issue, yes, you can trust her, but who knows? I mean, they end up all being soft imperialists in the end. But the Biden administration has doubled down on its support of Israel. You know, this is a party that needs to be abandoned. I don't need to tell you that, though, if you follow this channel. Anyway, so please check out this interesting explanation about by a Palestinian about the map of Palestine. It's another one of a few examples of people explaining things very clearly. So thanks for watching.
Let's learn about the map of occupied Palestine and the rights that Palestinians don't have because of Israel. Please note that Palestine has a very complex history and I can't fit it all in one video. This video is mainly going to be about what Palestine is like right now. The main thing to know about the history is that in 1947, the land was called Palestine. And in 1948, Israel was created out of stolen Palestinian land. So the country of Israel is actually only about 73 years old. So just know that much. Okay, part one, the current legal map. According to international law, this is what Palestine and Israel is supposed to look like today. This is Israel, and these two are Palestine. This is what the international community officially recognizes as the borders of the land. To help you understand the different names of the regions and cities you're hearing about Palestine right now on social media, here's the breakdown. Starting with the Palestinian areas. This is called the West Bank, and it got its name in relation to the Jordan River. It's the land on the west side of the river, or west of the bank, hence West Bank. In Arabic, you'll hear it referred to as al-Daffa, which is the bank. Some of the major cities in the West Bank include Jerusalem, Bethlehem, Ramallah, Nablus, Khalil or Hebron, Jericho, and Jenin. And then this is called Gaza, which is short for Gaza Strip. Gaza is actually just one of the cities in that region. Some of the major cities here include the city of Gaza, Rafah, Khan Yunis, and Dir al-Balah. So the West Bank and Gaza together make up Palestine. Under international law, these lands are supposed to be 100% Palestinian. No Israeli presence, no argument. But instead of just Palestine, you'll hear it referred to as the Palestinian territories, which is the name the UN gave West Bank and Gaza because they're both illegally occupied by Israel. They have control over everyone and everything that goes in and out of the Palestinian territories. So if you wanted to drive from Jordan to the West Bank, you should be going through Jordanian border control and then Palestinian border control, right? But no, Israel has complete illegal control over the borders, so you have to go through Jordanian border control and then Israeli border control to get into the West Bank. So repeat after me, illegal Israeli occupation. Now, do Palestinians only live in the Palestinian territories? No, they do not. You'll also find Palestinians living in Israel, which we Palestinians often refer to as 48 or 48 in Arabic, which is short for 1948, the year that the country of Israel was created and the Palestinians from current day Israel were either killed or forced to leave their land and never return. So you might hear Palestinians say something like, أنا من 48, which means I'm from 48. And we also call it 48 because we don't really enjoy calling it Israel, knowing that that land was stolen from us in 1948. Now, there are some areas in 48 that weren't completely wiped of the Palestinian people. There are some areas that still have a Palestinian population, some more than others. Some of the major cities here include Jaffa, or what the Israelis establish as Tel Aviv. There's also Haifa, Nazareth, Akka, and Safad. So Palestinians live in all three areas: West Bank, Gaza, and Israel. Part 2, borders and the illegal occupation. So these are the borders under international law, but in 1967, Israel took complete control over all Palestinian land. This is also when they stole Palestinian East Jerusalem. And according to international law, Jerusalem is supposed to be broken up into West and East Jerusalem, West being Israeli and East being Palestinian, which includes Al-Aqsa Mosque, which is why Israel has the ability to shoot up Al-Aqsa whenever they want because they have control over East Jerusalem. 1967 is also the year that Israel began allowing Israelis to move into the West Bank and establish illegal Israeli settlements, which was and still is condemned by the UN, but of course the UN is useless and they don't do anything about it. And to manage these illegal Israeli settlers living alongside the indigenous Palestinian people, Israel divided the West Bank into 3 areas. Area A under full Palestinian control, Area B under joint Palestinian-Israeli control, and then Area C under full Israeli control. And of course, Israel strategically zoned Area C, the Israeli-controlled areas and where the settlements are, to contain the majority of West Bank's agricultural land, water, and resources. And Palestinians have very little access to these. These settlements are fully protected by Israeli occupation forces. The cities are surrounded by massive walls, watchtowers, barbed wires, and guarded by Israeli gunmen. And I don't mean like these small little Israeli settlements. I mean settlements the size of massive cities with populations of 75,000 Israelis, 60,000 Israelis, depending on the area. These are massive cities. And the problem is that the size of these existing settlements are constantly growing and they're expanding them on top of new settlements being established. Israel's goal is to eventually have control over the entire West Bank. and dismantle all Palestinian areas by stealing land slowly, day by day, and squeezing out the Palestinians. Now in 1994, Israel began building the infamous wall to separate Israel and Palestine. But not along the border under international law. They built it following a border they drew and pushed out the border deeper into Palestine, giving Israel more land than they already stole in the West Bank. Then in 2005, Israel officially withdrew from Gaza and imposed a blockade restricting any form of movement by land, air, or sea. And that's why people refer to Gaza as an open-air prison, because Israel has control over the borders and the Palestinian people are literally trapped inside, despite the fact that it's one of the world's most densely populated cities. And that's why it's so dangerous when things like COVID come up or when Israel bombs them, because Israel deliberately rejects medical equipment and care and food from entering Gaza. Israel has complete control over the West Bank and Gaza borders. Beyond just the people, they have control over imports and exports, which they strategically restrict to suppress any form of economic growth for the Palestinians. And because of this, so many Palestinians in West Bank and Gaza are struggling to find basic work because Israel is literally choking out their economy until it dies. And finally, part 3, Palestinian rights in the 3 areas, starting with movement within the respective areas. Within Gaza Strip, Palestinians can move freely, but in the West Bank, Palestinians cannot move freely because of all the settlements and zoning. Israel has checkpoints set up all throughout the West Bank and can reject Palestinians from moving around anytime they want without giving a reason. They also put up roadblocks wherever and whenever, and Palestinians have to just find another way to get around. A trip from one city to another that should take max 30 minutes by car can easily take up to 2.5 hours because of all the checkpoints and roadblocks. And then Palestinians in Israel can move freely within Israel. Now, in terms of movement from region to region, Palestinians in both West Bank and Gaza are not allowed to enter Israel freely. They have to apply for a permit, and most of the time, Israel rejects them. This is especially problematic because Palestinians aren't allowed to visit their holy mosque Al-Aqsa in Jerusalem without Israel's permission. Palestinians in the West Bank aren't freely allowed to visit Gaza, and people in Gaza aren't allowed to freely visit the West Bank or Israel. And then in terms of international movement trying to leave Israel or Palestine, for the West Bank and Gaza, Israel has to give permission to leave the country and travel internationally, which is also problematic because Israel does not allow the West Bank or Gaza to have airports or train systems. For West Bank Palestinians to travel internationally, they have to first get permission from Israel, then take a bus all the way to Jordan, and then fly out through the Jordanian airport just to go to another country because Israel doesn't allow them to have their own airport. They can't fly directly out of the West Bank, nor can they fly out of Israel because they don't have permission to travel there freely. And then Palestinians in Israel are allowed to travel to the West Bank and travel internationally as they please. Israel does give them a bit more freedom than the Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza. But that doesn't mean they're not discriminated against in Israel. Israel does treat them like second-class citizens. Basically, Palestinians in the occupied territories just don't have the same resources to be able to fight off the Israeli military force, which is backed by the US. They have control over both pieces of land and essentially can determine the fate of all the Palestinians that live there. And no country wants to help defend Palestine or hold Israel accountable for their actions, so Israel can literally do whatever they want to the Palestinians with zero consequences. Perfect example, Sheikh Jarrah, which is occupied by Israel, and nobody's doing anything, not even the UN. Israel does what they want with impunity. And this is why Palestinians are so angry and frustrated, because for decades, they've been living under Israeli rule with none of the rights of the Israeli people, which is what makes Israel a racist, fascist apartheid state. Hopefully this very long but comprehensive video helps you understand how we got to where we are today in terms of Sheikh Jarrah and the Al-Aqsa attacks, and now Gaza being bombed. A'udhu billah. There's more information of what's happening right now saved in my story highlights. Please help spread the word of what Israel is doing to the Palestinian people. Please pray for the Palestinian people. Assalamu alaikum.